series from the European Organisation Design Forum. This series brings together researchers and practitioners to discuss the issues shaping the future of organisation design. Today's topic is Beyond AI Adoption, Designing Organisations for Adaptation. I'm delighted to be joined by Bob Gower, founder and practice lead at Splendid Torch. Splendid Torch starts from a simple idea. Adopting AI is not the same as changing how an organisation works. Its work focuses on the gap between introducing new technology and adapting strategy, governance, operations, capability, and culture around what the technology makes possible. Today, we'll explore what that means for organisation design, why AI can expose problems that were already present, and how organisations can become better at adapting to change. Bob, welcome and thank you for joining us.
It's my pleasure.
Thank you for being here. Bob, could you start by telling us a little bit about your background and what led you to create Splendid Torch?
Sure. Yeah. So I don't know how far back to go. I've had many careers in my life, but the one that I think was really pivotal was I was a design director at a newspaper at the San Francisco Examiner back sort of in the late 90s and early aughts. And that was a very interesting time to be in that particular business. Not only were we being disrupted by technology, but our business model was being disrupted. When Craigslist came online, basically all classified ads started happening for free online, which took really about 50% of our operating budget away. So we had to adapt to kind of changing technological conditions. We also had to adapt to sort of changing business conditions all at the same time. And as you may have tracked, if you're interested at all in the history of media in America and sort of secondary papers within sort of big markets, it hasn't been pretty. Like it was not something that many papers survived. We saw a lot of consolidation in that time. That led me I went back to school. I got an MBA. I focused on sustainability because I was very interested in how organizations actually operate sort of socially and environmentally and sort of like what their real impact on the world is, not just what their financial impact is. And then that led me really deeply into a study of how organizations work, how teams form, how people start to trust each other and to perform and become a high-performing team. And also how organizations then can kind of coordinate the output of these teams in order to produce value in the market, right? It seems very relatively simple, but it's this incredibly complex project, right? It involves human emotion, it involves incentives, it involves business structure, the ability to pay people, decision-making, like where decisions get made and by whom. It's sort of like, it's this very holistic way of looking at organizations. And so for about the past 15 years, that's what I've made my work. I worked in something called agile software development for quite a while. Then I worked in something called responsive organization design. I was actually one of the people I was adjacent, let's say, I don't want to overclaim here, but I was adjacent to the people who were forming a lot of the ideas in that space. And I wrote a book on agile. I wrote a book on team development. And it's just sort of been my work. Now, obviously, AI is the big thing. And so for the last 2 years, I've been collaborating with some colleagues, and we've been asking ourselves this question: what does AI change? And we think it changes kind of everything. It unlocks a lot of possibility, but it also creates a whole new sort of operating environment that's a lot less stable. It hasn't been stable for the last 20 years, but I think it's getting a lot less stable now. And that's the sort of the place we've decided to play. That's why I created Splendid Torch, and it's why the five of us who make up the company got involved.
So I appreciate your background, and we'll perhaps touch on the influence of sustainability and how that is shaping your direction of Splendid Torch, but focusing on from adoption to adaptation. And I'm really kind of struck by that. You distinguish between adopting AI and actually adapting the organization around it. What is the difference, and where do organizations tend to get stuck?
Besides everywhere right now. I appreciate that. Yeah. So adoption is, basically bolting something onto your organization, right? It's like, I'm going to take this thing and I'm going to put it into my org and we'll see what happens. the metaphor we like to use a lot is like if you have a horse-drawn carriage and you adopt a jet engine without adapting that horse-drawn carriage, the actual structure of the organization, to this new technology, you're going to just blow things apart. Things are going to fall apart. So common adoption, let's call them anti-patterns, would be, well, I know who I'm talking to, so hopefully we're familiar. I can use some inside baseball language, but the theory of constraints, right? If we go back to sort of like where a constraint lies within an organization, and that we always have a constraint and we want to design to that constraint rather than try to move that constraint around, because if we start moving the constraint around, it'll move to a place where we don't know. So simplest terms, right? I speed up one part of the organization, I create a queue in the other part of the organization that then causes a dysfunction in that other part of the organization. And so one of the places we see, sort of the big constraint, or is decision-making. Speed of decision-making, has been sort of a strategic benefit for a long time. But in the age of AI, right, like how people use AI in order to change their work, right, in their locality within the organization is really important. But going back to theory of constraints, we want to make sure that we're not breaking other parts of the organization. So the main sort of like super, what do you call it, category of dysfunction we see is that organizations are, they're speeding up their own dysfunction. There's already dysfunction in the organization, and now you've just made it faster, which does make it more apparent sometimes, which gives you the opportunity to address it. But it's really this idea of adopting a very revolutionary technology in a way without considering its full system impact. Like, I think that would be probably the core of the dysfunction. Now, there's all sorts of stuff that exists inside of that, but inside that category. But that's the main thing we see.
So, just kind of touching on that point of exposing a full system impact. With regards to what AI reveals in an organization, you argue that AI often makes existing problems more visible rather than creating them. What kinds of problems are you seeing exposed in your work?
Yeah, I mean, I don't mean to just sort of keep harping on decision making, but I think that's one of the issues, and decision making really writ large, right? Like, if you think about a role and I think a lot about decision rights, or the level of authority that a specific role or a specific team has within an organization. And I think we see sort of two main dysfunctions there. One is that we don't know what our decision rights are. Like, so many people, so many individual contributors, so many team leads are operating inside of an environment where their decision rights have not been made explicit, right? It's sort of like, and this can get very specific in terms of AI adoption, right? Like, they're just like, go use AI for your stuff. And like, okay, well, what does that mean, right? So then we start getting into data governance, and are we changing how we work, or, are we fundamentally rethinking how we're structured? Because AI kind of opens up a lot of different kinds of organizational possibilities, right? So not knowing how a decision gets made is sort of maybe the first dysfunction. And the second one is it gets made way too slow, right? The decision, the point of authority sits very, very far away from the information, right? So this is typical, like in responsive design, we talk about you distribute authority to the edges of the organization, right? This is sort of classic agile or responsive, or if you're familiar with holacracy or sociocracy, these more distributed authority models, which I'm very fond of, but currently also see the limitations of in some conditions. But like, this idea is that we want to be able to push decision down to where it matters, and to where the information is good, and to where the response time can be relatively fast, right? Because if we move too slowly, we're kind of dead in the water, right? The world is changing. Like, our sort of unofficial, we don't put it out there too much, but like, we're about creating adaptive organizations for an unstable world. And we chose the word unstable very specifically because we're like, this is the world we all live in now. We always think that we're going to return to normalcy, but we're not, right? Like, what is normal? We're not going back. We have to go forward, and going forward means learning to operate in increasingly unstable conditions. And I think I'm not alone in that observation, obviously.
So I appreciate your insight with regards to that link between strategy and leadership, and you've kind of highlighted when you talk about leadership, we're not talking about a formal position in an organization. We're talking about a role, and there's different forms of more distributed forms of leadership. So thinking about strategy and the relationship with leadership, what needs to change in the way leaders think about strategy when AI is becoming part of everyday work?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the headline is, right, like a static strategy in a dynamic world is a losing proposition, right? That strategies, 5-year plans, I don't think are realistic anymore, right? That the idea, because you're trying to predict an environment. Like, I don't think we can predict 18 months into the advance, like what AI is going to be capable of. And and then we had to add into the mix the market dynamics, the political dynamics, like there's a whole lot of stuff that seems very, very unstable. And I think some of that is manageable, right? And I hope for our public sector, our political leaders, right, that they will help us create a more stable system in some ways. But the technology, at any rate, is just going to keep changing. And even if the technology didn't change at all, like let's say we just froze development now, LLMs, to me, like this particular technology is so powerful that we haven't yet unlocked even a fraction of what its real value is. People are experimenting, people are trying things. We hear a lot of horror stories or a lot of like frustration stories, like in from our market. But really, it's the idea is, I think, that we need to be more dynamic in the way we think about strategy. And this leads to a very, very specific piece that I think needs to come into it, is to lead dynamically doesn't mean leading by the seat of our pants. It doesn't mean like just going with our gut, right? Going with our gut kind of works in some circumstances, but it's not very forgiving, right? Like if our guts are wrong, right? Our emotions, like what Richard Feynman, the great physicist, said, right? The first rule is to not fool, and you're the easiest person to fool, right? So going with our gut is often us fooling ourselves, right? So what we do at Splendid Torch, and what we do with our clients, is we want to move to a very more disciplined, hypothesis-driven, and by hypothesis-driven, I mean falsifiable hypothesis. I mean, we go in knowing like, this is what we think we should be doing, and this is how we'll know we're wrong, which is kind of, we've been talking about this in design thinking for years, right? But from an organizational leadership perspective, it's a little bit of an inversion, right? It's like, how do I govern or lead my organization in a way that has more transparency to it? Hey, this is what our hypothesis is. This is where we think we're going. This is how we think we're going to be wrong. Help us prove, let's aim at being wrong rather than aim at being right, because that leads to all sorts of kind of confirmation biases and things. So I think these things that have been like the headline to all of this, right, is these things that have been nice to haves in the past, where we've thought about like, psychological safety and trust on a team, right? Stanley McChrystal, in his book Team of Teams, what was that, 15 years ago now, right? He wrote about like the leader is a gardener, not a chess master. The leader like enables people, right? We've been talking about this for a long time, but that talk, even though we've been using it strategically, has been relegated a bit to the nice to have category. This is for enlightened leaders who care about people. It's nice to have. And by the way, I only want to work for leaders who care about people like this. Those are my people. But I also think it's becoming a real strategic necessity, right? Because if we're going to be adaptive, which is being dynamic, which is changing direction based on sensing and responding, new information comes in and it changes us. If we're going to do that, then we're going to need to lean on each other in a way. We're going to need to trust each other more. We're going to need to be able to bring up concerns, which require psychological safety. Hey, this is wrong. I learned something bad. We can't fear punishment. There's all sorts of things that kind of get wrapped up to that. And this goes back to my holistic view of organizations that I mentioned earlier.
I think that's very, very insightful, making that connection between kind of scientific thinking around proving that you're wrong. I think that's a really interesting idea. And I'd just like to comment, there are some comments in the chat from Jose, for example, with regards to uncertainty and how the unknown is a norm, and we need to respond faster today. And I suppose that leads us to exploring governance and decision making.
Yeah.
If we are being explicit with our strategy, we're being very open about, let's prove ourselves wrong, let's make decisions as we go based on information that comes in. How should organizations then think about governance and decision rights and accountability as people begin using AI in more parts of the business? Is there a risk management element we need to think about? What are your thoughts around governance and decision making, and how that could look like?
Yeah, and I think I'm just gonna repeat. So we put so our model, we have a model. We're good consultants, right? So our model, looks at like four main areas, and strategy, governance, operations, and then individual enablement, right? So adopting any technology, you kind of have to line those four things up. But what we do is we put culture at the center of that, because culture, we believe, becomes, in a dynamic environment, becomes the connective tissue. And in governance specifically, so the problems we see, like we go into an organization, we're like, show us your policy, right? What's your AI use policy here? And we find that it's usually either so restrictive that in order to follow it, people basically can't use AI, right? And so then that leads to an awful lot of shadow adoption, we call it, right? Like I was actually just working with a company. I had to do it's a small company, they do manufacturing, few hundred people. They're in the Midwest here. And the COO brought me in, and I was so I did a whole survey. I was like, how are people let's talk. Like, how are you using it? And I found out that the COO was using his own instance of ChatGPT, and he was uploading screenshots of things to that, because nobody really knows, like, because there is this rule, like, because the other anti-pattern is it's so vague. It's like, well, use it as much as you want to, but just don't share sensitive data with it. We're like, well, what is sensitive data in this environment? Like, what is the market consequential data? And if we're using like an enterprise version of Claude, which has zero data retention, does that then change what we can use in it? Smaller companies are the ones that are really struggling with this, and big companies struggle with it too. But like smaller companies, definitely struggle with it. And then, I've also worked with like a Fortune 500 company. They're doing everything right. They're very dialed in terms of governance, and they're giving a lot of training to people. They're giving people, but they're also hitting this kind of plateau because, and I don't know, this may not quite relate to your question. I apologize if I'm digressing a bit, but like what they're finding is that people are using it in this AI in this kind of transactional way. They're like, well, I'll use it for this specific task. Like one of the common, what do you call it? One of the common like results of AI hitting an organization we see is that emails get longer. People are sending 20-page docs to each other, which is really cruel, I think, rather than saying, so so a lot of it kind of comes back to sort of like that personal discipline about how we're using it, but also the organizational opportunity, we believe, is fundamentally rethinking the way work gets done in the organizations. And that requires space, that requires time, that requires some degree of failure tolerance on the part of leadership in the organizations. Like, you can't be dinging people for making mistakes if you want them to reinvent the way that they're working. And then the big problem always is everybody's on a deadline. The most convenient thing to do on a deadline is regress to the mean, go back to the old way of doing things. So we'll see like a little bit of adoption during the summer months, and then you'll see like we start hitting, September, which we're all heading towards, and like the email boxes get flooded and people start going back to the old way of doing things.
Yeah, very interesting. And I think you've touched on some really interesting points, looking at policy from the formal to the informal around kind of shadow adoption, if you will, of the example you provided. And you've highlighted some of the unintended consequences with longer emails. So at an operational level, how work actually gets done, as you kind of alluded to there at the end, where do you see the biggest opportunities to redesign workflows? You've talked a lot about decision making rather than simply adding AI to existing processes. Opportunities, do you see any consistent areas across the work that you've been doing?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and I think this goes a little bit to, I think it's a framework you developed or you worked on about, was it job design? Was that what you shared it with me, right? And so,
Yeah.
and I think to me, like that's a huge opportunity, right? That we this won't be news to anybody here, but a job is a bundle of tasks, right? Essentially, right? Like and if we can begin to fragment those a little bit more, I know that word sounds a little scary, but like if we can begin to think really clearly about what a job is in terms of the tasks that it has to do and the outcomes it has to generate, we can begin to decouple that maybe from a role, or we can kind of create a little bit more of a fragment. I hate that I'm using this word. I didn't come in intending to, but a little more of a fragmented sense of like what my job is. Like I know what it is I'm here to do, the outcomes I'm here to generate, maybe the tasks that I'm responsible for, the deliverables that I'm responsible for. But then we can begin to say, well, maybe this bundle works a little bit better over here with this person, right? Like what if we sequenced it a little bit differently? Or what if we gave that bundle to agents or a series of agents, right? Which is like where agent design is, comes in. And so I think that's one area that's really interesting. The other area for me is so another like little life history thing. My wife is a organic gardener. Like she's extraordinary. Her mother was a big pioneer in that world, and I've spent a lot of time on farms and in gardens, and I'm getting my fingernails dirty and all of that. And what we so kind of going back to the leader as gardener metaphor, right? Is that you can think of that as like sort of it's very pastoral. Like it's very like, oh, isn't it nice? We're just out there digging with a trowel. But really, gardening is messy work. It's confusing work. There's all sorts of stuff you can't control in it in terms of weather, in terms of climate, in terms of, and this year was good and that last year was bad, and the bee population. Like there's all sorts of things that kind of like figure into this. And what actually happens in gardening, at that kind of gardening, not necessarily heavy petrochemical factory farm, monocultures, which have its place, but that you kind of can flatten things down a little bit. But both are very information intensive, right? I actually did a bunch of work for John Deere years ago with helping with the teams that were building their navigation systems, and I learned like that these things are like having good information is really, really important, right? As a farmer and as a gardener, I'm going to actually contradict what I just said. I'm not comparing and contrasting. In both kinds of farming, you need to have good information. And what AI is remarkable at is pattern matching within an unstructured set of data, right? And so we've actually become, so at Splendid Torch, we've developed a research instrument. One of our people is a behavioral scientist who used to run people and operations for Chanel, for a multinational, for about a decade, Julie Close. So she sits between sort of the science world and the operational world. And at first we were like, oh, let's build a diagnostic. Julie, you're good at that. And then we slowly got at the idea that no, having the information and being able and unstructured information and being able to structure is important. The reason I bring this up is I think organizations run on information. I think org charts are this way of kind of trying to flatten that information. This happens over here and this happens over there. And it creates something which is dynamic, which is a group of humans, and tries to make it a little more predictable, a little more linear, a little more mechanical. And so this is where I'm aiming all of my attention. I'm a little bit older. This is the third act of my career. This is sort of like my legacy play to a certain degree. And like, that's the world that I want to play in, because I believe that we can profoundly impact the way organizations operate. I think there are organizational models out there that we haven't even begun to scratch the surface of. And I'm very, very excited by the idea of creating organizations that are able to see themselves more clearly, more immediately in the moment. There's less lag in terms of what's happening, what's healthy in what parts of the organization and what dimension, right? Is it team trust is on the decline? Is it team throughput is on the decline or on the growth? Or, what's the correlation between these various things? And I think AI has huge, huge, huge potential there.
Thank you, and I appreciate the metaphor with farming, and we can perhaps kind of continue with that. I just want to acknowledge we do have some comments in the chat. We'll certainly touch on those comments towards the end, and maybe I'll take some questions, if you will, Bob, if you've got time. So Splendid Torch, You focus within your model and what we've discussed around culture, enablement. What helps people actually work differently rather than just giving people a new tool? And can you expand on your comment with regards to the importance of culture and how that is kind of in the middle of your model?
Yeah, 100%. So I think two things. The first is, and hopefully maybe the constituency here knows this, the work of Donella Meadows. She's sort of one of my gurus. She was a MIT, what kind of a systems pioneer. She worked under, I can't remember his name, the Club of Rome, and a lot of stuff around sustainability. But Donella, she has a wonderful article I go back to again and again. I actually include it as a knowledge base in many of my AI tools, which is like places to intervene in a system. If you want a system to change, where's the most useful place to intervene? Where's the most impactful place to intervene? And what she says is the mindset out of which that organization grows, the sort of perspective out of which the leadership has, she believes is sort of, and I would concur, right, is one of the most important places. The reason culture becomes so important, I think, is twofold. One is that if I have a change of mindset, if I have an insight as a leader and I want to enact a change in my organization, I was an agile guy for years, right? And I would go into these agile transformations. And usually it was because somebody watched a stupid TED talk or read a book, and then they were forcing agile on their people. Like that was like I was there, and then I became like the strong man, or the external guy you could blame, right? To kind of come in. But often there was a lot of headwind. There was a lot of cultural headwind against the change because, it's not rocket science. People don't like to change. People don't like to be changed. People like to feel like they have some ownership and some participation. And I think that's one of the places where culture becomes very important, is because if I have trust, if people trust me and I trust them, then we're going to be able to make decisions much faster. We're going to be able to back out of bad decisions much faster because we'll have better information, because people will say, hey, this isn't working for me, and people will actually listen to it. And this is where I think the real tragedy of our time, one of the real tragedies of our times right now, is that all of the news, and I know that they've backed off from this a little bit, but like the news coming out of the big, Anthropic and OpenAI and all these is that AI is going to replace workers, right? And if you're trying to create trust in an organization, that's not a great thing, right? If I think I'm training my replacement, I'm going to be much more resistant. And sort of one of the things we find is that often it's the most technically savvy people that are the most resistant and sometimes actively undermining AI adoption especially within the larger organizations. And they're not wrong, right? And so, which is also why it's so inspiring to see, somebody like what IKEA did with their customer success or customer service people, retraining them to become, designers, like actually improving their, like giving them more skills and giving them a more sensitive role rather than just sort of laying them off. And I think we really need to think very carefully about sort of the narratives what do we tell ourselves about this? And what do we tell our team about this? And what do we collectively begin to believe about this? And the truth is that this can be undermined very, very easily. So in our diagnostic, we're very precise about who are we talking to and what's the delta. Is it the leadership believes one thing and the people on the front lines believe something else? Let's understand that delta, because that's where the work is. That's where the magic needs to happen in terms of changing the way these organizations operate and really adapting to AI rather than simply being a victim to it or adopting it.
Thank you, Bob. And it's an excellent example referring to IKEA and that narrative around, is this a technology that replaces workers, or is there an upskilling opportunity here? And I appreciate there's a few more comments coming in the chat, and we'll touch on those in a moment. But you just kind of finished kind of a stream of thought, and perhaps we could go just a little bit deeper before we kind of start to take some questions from participants. Adaptive capacity. You refer to organizations that have adaptive capacity. What does that look like in practice, Paul?
Yeah. So, and actually I'm looking at the comments now. I think somebody said something about mindset shift isn't enough. And absolutely, right. Mindset shift is only valuable because it drives behavioral shift, right? Like that's the value. I'm not advocating for some kind of manifestation, right? We're not going to manifest change because we suddenly changed our mind. It's not magic. It's I change the way I look at the world, and that changes the decisions I make, and that changes my behavior. But adaptive capacity, just sort of in its simplest form, is the ability to respond to incoming information without having to spin up a big transformation program, which usually requires a lot of pain. It's this ability to sense and respond. One of the things we focus on, and a term that we've coined is minimum effective intervention. We borrow it from medicine, where the dose makes the poison, right? So the minimum effective dose of a compound is what makes it medicine, right? Like if I have a headache, I want to take the minimum effective dose. I don't want to take the maximum dose to start off with. I want to take the minimum dose and see if that does the job, because maximum dose can become a poison, right? We start moving closer and closer to poison. And I believe the same is kind of true of change, right? That if we developed a disciplined, hypothesis-driven, sort of scientifically minded practice of, I'm sensing this thing in the environment, and I want to try the smallest change possible that will address this change that I'm seeing in the environment, we build up our knowledge of both ourselves, of the market that we operate in, of the technologies that we're using, which makes hopefully our future decisions better. And hopefully if we can do these sort of like continuous micro changes, it can avoid the need for these big, massive organizational transformation efforts. And I've been in the middle of so many of them, and I've seen so many of them. I don't think I've ever seen one truly succeed, not the way we thought it would in those original meetings. I mean, we've delivered benefit, not saying, it's all been trash, but in the beginning, you're like, oh, we're gonna transform our organization. In the end, you end up like, well, our throughput's a bit better, and our team's a bit happier, and our retention rate's a bit better, or something like that, right? So, really, I believe that we have to get really, really good at examining ourselves, examining our markets, knowing ourselves, knowing what we're capable of, and making these small moves in a disciplined way. To me, that's really what drives adaptive capacity at the end of the day.
Excellent. Thank you, Bob. And perhaps this is a good time to kind of touch on some of the comments in the chat function here. I want to see if we can, perhaps there's a question that we could touch on, or any comments we should acknowledge. And Jose, thank you very much for your comments. I think, why don't we look at Mark's comment here? Sure. Richard Lucas and I believe it moves upstream as well as downstream. As the economics of production of knowledge and work falls, deciding what to ask, what to produce becomes as, if not more important, including when not to produce. And perhaps you could kind of touch on that, and we'll kind of tie that comment into looking ahead. Beyond the current wave of AI, what do organizations need to learn now that will help them respond for major disruptions? And we started this conversation and saying we're not going back to the new normal. If the present is the age of disruption, as I think we kind of touched on, what do organizations need to learn now? So if we're perhaps moving beyond AI and other disruptive technological waves in the future, what's some kind of closing thoughts or things for us to perhaps reflect on? And it'd be nice to have some comments in the chat, and perhaps we'll kind of touch on kind of Jose's comment as well.
Sure thing. It was Mark's comment, I think, actually, wasn't it? Yeah.
That was Mark's comment.
Yeah. About decision making upstream. Yeah. And if I'm reading it right, it's just sort of like deciding what not to do is as important as deciding what to do, right? And sort of like locating, where knowledge gets produced, where it gets consumed, and then how that drives decision making within our organization is really important. I'm going to just go a little bit more abstract, so I know we're closing, but like, I think at the end of the day, and I maintain this, right? Like I've been like a systems theory guy since like the late 90s, right? I've been kind of reading this stuff and participating in it. I got into Agile because that was where I saw it, the rubber hitting the road. I was like, oh, these people are trying to do applied systems theory, so that's what I want to work in, and it's really kind of driven my thinking. And I think that one, organizations of humans are complex adaptive systems, right? Like that we have to get it through our heads. Talking about mindset shift, that we are not talking about a linear machine-like structure anymore. And as it moves faster and as things change more quickly, the exciting thing about AI to me is, well, there's many exciting things, but really the interesting thing is nobody was going home and playing with a CRM before they adopted it at work. Nobody was building a personal relationship, with their, with their ERP or whatever. Like people are now though really fascinated by this tool, and they're building like deep going back to that COO I talked about. He wanted to use it because his instance was named, it knew him, it understood how he thought. And so this kind of like, and that's wonderful. But when you start to scale that, right, because you're basically speeding up people's thinking and you're creating more idiosyncratic thinking in some ways, right? Because my tools work the way I work. They don't necessarily work the way my colleague works. And the benefit often is in the collision between those two things. But we're sort of like speeding all of these things up. So just sort of like zooming all the way out. Organizations are complex adaptive systems. They are systems of people, and we ourselves are complex adaptive systems. Our brains are literally most likely one of the most complex structures to have ever existed in the entire universe. And now we're lumping them all together. We're adding AI into the mix, and things are just going to, I guess things are going to get weird. Things are going to get crazy. But if we stay anchored to each other, if we stay anchored to the idea of organization as community of humans, and now community of our agents as well, right? But a community of humans whose task is to provide value to other humans, right? Like that's what an organization is to me, in its best manifestation, right? An organization is a group of humans getting together to provide value to another group of humans and receive some value in return in this sort of self-sustaining way, which is one of the things that makes capitalism great and also can make it suspect at times. But just remember that we are here to work together. That's where the joy is. That's where the pleasure is. That's where the excitement is. That's where the real human to human value is. And these tools can be a really intimate part of that. They can also be very destructive to this project, right? But it's remembering who we are, remembering where we are, and remembering what we're trying to do. To me, that's what we need to do. Not try to become experts in an individual technology, because with a technology that's changing so quickly and this sort of like vertical curve, innovation curve, right? Like that's a losing game. So I don't know if that's a good place to leave it, but that's my thought.
I think it is. And I'd just like to acknowledge the comments in the chat. I don't think we have time to get through all those kind of comments, and we can continue the conversation, if you will, in the kind of LinkedIn chat after the live session. So I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. And of course, Bob, thank you very much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure.
And everybody, please connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm not there a lot these days, but we're actually moving out of stealth mode, and I'll be releasing a self-paced diagnostic tool. Fingers crossed next week. So follow me on LinkedIn, and you'll hopefully see that. Anyway, thanks so much, Andrew, and everybody. Thanks for being here, and thanks for having me.
Thank you, Bob. Take care. Bye for now, everyone.